Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? Ranking the most powerful beings in cosmic horror. That is what we are about to attempt. The central idea is simple, but it carries risk. We are taking entities created to erase human meaning and placing them into a hierarchy. The great old ones, the outer gods, the forces that move between dimensions and exist beyond language. We are going to compare them. Lovecraft wrote in the early 20th century, when new science was stretching the universe beyond imagination, and old beliefs were losing their grip. His fiction reflected that shift. Humanity was no longer the center. It was small, fragile, and temporary. The beings in his stories were not villains to defeat. They were reminders of scale. Later writers expanded this mythos, adding names, structures, and fragments of order to something that resisted order from the start. And still, readers have always tried to measure them, to decide which stands above the rest. In this episode, we will move step by step from ancient entities that sleep beneath the sea to the vast presence at the edge of existence, using textual evidence, literary history, and philosophical reasoning. But there is a quiet truth waiting at the top of this list. By the time we reach it, you may realize the ranking reveals less about cosmic beings and more about the human need to rank them at all. There is something fundamentally dishonest about what we are doing here. We should acknowledge that before going any further. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, the gaunt recluse of Providence, Rhode Island, never once sat down and asked himself which of his creations was the most powerful. He was not building a pantheon. He was building a mood. Between 1917 and 1937, across roughly 60 works of fiction, Lovecraft assembled a loose constellation of alien entities, forbidden texts, and decaying New England landscapes, all in service of a single, philosophical proposition that humanity is cosmically irrelevant, and that the universe, if it has any character at all, is one of blind indifference. This is the foundation everything else rests on. When Lovecraft wrote Dagon in 1917, he was not introducing the first monster in a ranked bestiary. He was a 27-year-old amateur journalist, channeling anxieties about the ocean, about deep time, about the fragility of the rational mind. When Cthulhu appeared in 1928's The Call of Cthulhu, it was as a literary device, a psychic broadcast from something vast and sleeping, used to demonstrate that human civilization is a thin crust over an abyss. The entity served the theme. The theme did not serve the entity. Lovecraft's private letters confirm this orientation. In a 1933 letter to James F. Morton, he wrote that his Yog-Sothothery was merely a convenient backdrop, a set of atmospheric props that could be rearranged as any particular story required. He expressed mild bewilderment that readers treated his inventions as a coherent mythology. The beings were tools, shaped by whatever philosophical point a given narrative demanded. Cthulhu could be imprisoned beneath the Pacific in one story and psychically dominating the planet in another, because consistency was never the point. So, where did the impulse to rank these beings come from? The answer lies partly with Lovecraft's own circle. Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Frank Belknap Long, and others began cross-referencing each other's creations during the 1930s. Smith would mention Cthulhu. Lovecraft would reference Smith's Tsathoggua. This mutual borrowing was playful, collegial, and entirely informal. But it created something none of them intended: the impression of a shared canonical universe with internal rules. If Cthulhu and Tsathoggua existed in the same fictional space, then the question of their relative power became structurally possible, even if no one was yet asking it. The person who began asking it in earnest was August Derleth. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth became the primary custodian of the mythos through his publishing house, Arkham House. Derleth imposed categories that Lovecraft had deliberately avoided. He assigned elemental affiliations, Cthulhu as water, Cthugha as fire, Ithaqua as air. He introduced a moral framework, positing benevolent elder gods who opposed the malevolent outer gods. He created, in effect, the first power hierarchy. Derleth's systematization made the mythos accessible to a far wider audience. It also, according to scholars like S.T. Joshi, fundamentally betrayed its philosophical core by replacing indifference with a cosmic good versus evil narrative that Lovecraft would have found simplistic. Then came the games. Sandy Peterson's 1981 tabletop role-playing game, Call of Cthulhu, did something unprecedented. It gave these entities statistics. Cthulhu received hit points, a damage rating, a sanity loss value. Azathoth received higher numbers across every category. Nyarlathotep received 1,000 forms, each with its own stat block. The game was brilliant, influential, and deeply respectful of its source material. It was also, by necessity, a ranking system. You cannot run a game without knowing what can kill you and what cannot. The hierarchy that Lovecraft never intended and Derleth crudely sketched was now codified in percentile dice and character sheets. What followed in the decades since, fan wikis, tier lists, YouTube videos, Reddit debates, is simply the logical extension of that process. We are inheritors of Derleth's categories and Peterson's statistics, whether we acknowledge it or not. The ranking exists. The question is whether we can engage with it honestly, recognizing it as a human imposition on material that was designed to resist exactly this kind of order. That tension between the desire to rank and the impossibility of ranking is where this entire analysis lives. Lovecraft did not invent cosmic horror from nothing. He assembled it from pieces that had been lying around Western culture for centuries, and understanding those pieces is essential before we attempt to sort his creations by power. The intellectual genealogy runs through philosophy, theology, and earlier weird fiction, each tradition contributing a specific element to the composite we now call the Cthulhu Mythos. The deepest root is philosophical. Lovecraft was a devoted reader of Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century German pessimist who proposed that the fundamental nature of reality is a blind, purposeless force he called the will. The will has no goal, no intelligence, no moral character. It simply drives endlessly, pointlessly. Lovecraft's highest tier entities, particularly Azathoth, map almost perfectly onto Schopenhauer's concept. Azathoth is literally described as a blind idiot god, a mindless nuclear chaos at the center of infinity. The philosophical debt is direct and acknowledged. When we rank Azathoth at the apex of cosmic power, we are effectively ranking Schopenhauer's will above all other metaphysical principles in the mythos. This is a philosophical claim disguised as a monster tier list. Friedrich Nietzsche contributed a different element. His famous warning about gazing into the abyss, that the abyss gazes also into you, becomes almost mechanically literal in Lovecraft's fiction. Every encounter with a mythos entity operates on this principle. The knowledge flows both ways. To study Cthulhu is to become visible to Cthulhu. To read about Yog-Sothoth is to create a channel through which Yog-Sothoth might reach you. This bidirectional quality of cosmic knowledge is what makes ranking these entities feel genuinely transgressive rather than merely academic. Nietzsche meant his aphorism metaphorically. Lovecraft took it as engineering specification. Earlier weird fiction provided the narrative scaffolding. Lord Dunsany's The Gods of Pagana, published in 1905, presented a cosmology of dreaming in different deities, gods who created the world accidentally and might end it by waking up. The structural parallel to Azathoth's dreaming is unmistakable. Lovecraft admired Dunsany enormously and explicitly credited him as an influence. Arthur Machen, the Welsh mystic whose 1894 novella The Great God Pan depicted the psychic destruction caused by direct contact with a higher reality, contributed the template for what we might call the encounter gradient. The idea that different levels of exposure to the divine produce different levels of damage, from unease to madness to death. There is also a theological dimension worth examining. In most religious traditions, celestial hierarchies imply meaning. The Christian chain of being, the Hindu cosmological layers, the Kabbalistic sephirot, all arrange higher powers in ascending orders that ultimately point toward purpose and design. Cosmic horror performs a precise inversion. The higher you climb in Lovecraft's implicit hierarchy, the less meaning you find. A deep one is horrible but comprehensible, a predatory species with biological imperatives. Cthulhu is a vast alien priest with a cult and a purpose, however alien. Azathoth, at the summit, has no mind at all. The hierarchy exists, but it points toward an absence rather than a presence. This is perhaps the cruelest innovation in the entire tradition. One more antecedent deserves mention: the apocalyptic mathematics of early 20th century physics. Lovecraft was writing during the period when Einstein's relativity, Hubble's expanding universe, and the early stirrings of quantum mechanics were demolishing comfortable Newtonian assumptions about a stable, comprehensible cosmos. The mythos entities, with their non-Euclidean geometries and extra-dimensional origins, are literary reflections of a universe that actual scientists were revealing to be stranger, vaster, and more indifferent than anyone had previously imagined. When we ask which cosmic entity is the most powerful, we are echoing a question that the physics of Lovecraft's era was already posing in different language. What is the most fundamental force in a universe that appears to have no author? These currents, Schopenhauer's purposeless will, Nietzsche's reciprocal abyss, Dunsany's dreaming gods, Machin's encounter gradient, inverted theology, and the vertigo of modern physics, all converge in the mythos. The entities we are about to rank are not simply monsters. They are philosophical propositions wearing tentacles, and the question of their relative power is, at bottom, a question about which proposition is the most devastating. Consider how these beings are named. This is not incidental. Lovecraft understood, perhaps instinctively, that the sound of a word creates expectations about the thing it describes. His entity names, Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, Tsathoggua, Azathoth, share a deliberate phonetic strangeness. They are guttural, consonant-heavy, and resistant to confident pronunciation. Lovecraft himself offered contradictory guidance on how to say Cthulhu, at various points suggesting approximations like Cthulhu and Tulu, while insisting that the actual name could not be reproduced by human vocal anatomy. This is not a failure of naming. It is naming as power statement. The entity exists beyond the range of human language, and the name we use is a degraded approximation, a lossy compression of something our mouths were never designed to shape. This phonetic alienness serves a ranking function that most analyses overlook. The more pronounceable an entity's name, the more domesticated it feels, and the lower it tends to sit on the implicit power hierarchy. Dagon is almost comfortable. It derives from the historical Philistine deity and slides easily into English. Cthulhu is harder, stranger, but has become familiar through repetition. We have collectively agreed on a rough pronunciation, and this very agreement has subtly reduced the name's alienating force. Yog-Sothoth resists domestication more successfully. Azathoth carries the terminal hiss of Thoth, the Egyptian god of knowledge, embedded in a framework of sibilants and dental stops that sound simultaneously archaic and inhuman. The names enact a phonetic hierarchy that mirrors the ontological one. The categorical terms we use to sort these beings, great old ones, outer gods, elder things, other gods, deserve scrutiny because most of them did not originate with Lovecraft in the forms we now employ. Lovecraft used great old ones and other gods loosely and interchangeably. The rigid taxonomy that separates great old ones, imprisoned or sleeping entities of planetary to stellar scope, from outer gods, active or ambient entities of cosmic to reality structural scope, was largely a post-Lovecraft construction solidified by Derleth and subsequent systematizers. This matters for our ranking because the categories themselves encode assumptions about relative power. To call something an outer god is to place it above a great old one before any analysis begins. The labels do our ranking for us, which is convenient but should make us suspicious. The liturgical language of mythos cults offers another window into the hierarchy. The chant associated with Cthulhu, Finglui Mglwinaf Cthulhu Relie Wugachnagul Vtagen, is translatable, however roughly. In his house at Relie, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. It has content. It describes a situation, a location, a state of being. The ritual invocations of higher entities tend to be less descriptive and more ecstatic. Ia Shub Niggurath is a cry, not a sentence. Azathoth's court is described through sound, piping, drumming, the thin, monotonous whining of accursed flutes, rather than through propositional language. The further up the hierarchy you go, the less language can do. Prayer becomes sound. Description becomes synesthesia. Naming becomes an admission of failure. There is a deeper symbolic architecture at work here as well. Lovecraft's entities tend to embody specific philosophical anxieties, and these anxieties can themselves be ranked by how fundamental they are to human existence. The deep ones embody fear of biological contamination, a social anxiety. Cthulhu embodies the discovery that human civilization is cosmically negligible, an existential anxiety. Yog-Sothoth embodies the realization that space and time themselves may be aspects of a living alien intelligence, an ontological anxiety. Azathoth embodies the possibility that reality has no author, no structure, and no point, an absolute anxiety, beneath which there is nothing left to fear. The symbolic language scales with the philosophical stakes. This is why the names matter so much. They are not labels attached to pre-existing creatures. They are linguistic events, moments where human language reaches toward something it cannot contain and records its own failure in the attempt. The name Azathoth does not describe the blind idiot god. It is the sound human language makes when confronted with the concept of purposeless infinity. Every name on our ranking list is a small monument to the inadequacy of the tool being used, and that inadequacy is itself a measure of power. The most effective trick in the entire Lovecraftian enterprise is one borrowed from the tradition of literary forgery, the invented source text. Lovecraft did not simply describe cosmic entities. He described books that described cosmic entities. The Necronomicon, attributed to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, the Pnakotic manuscripts, the Book of Eibon, De Vermis Mysterius, contributed by Robert Bloch, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, contributed by Robert E. Howard. These fictional grimoires serve a specific narrative function. They imply that knowledge of these beings has a history, that other scholars have attempted the same cataloging we are attempting now, and that it did not go well for them. This is a legitimation strategy. When a Lovecraft narrator encounters a cosmic entity, the horror is amplified by the revelation that this encounter was predicted in a text written centuries earlier. The entity was already known, already classified, and the classification did nothing to prevent the disaster. The Necronomicon, in particular, functions as an in-universe precursor to precisely the kind of power ranking we are constructing. Alhazred, supposedly writing in the 8th century, documented the relationships between various cosmic beings, their domains, their relative positions in a hierarchy of alien intelligences. He went mad and was, according to Lovecraft's fictional biography, devoured in broad daylight by an invisible monster. The implication is clear. The ranking exists. It can be assembled, and assembling it is a form of self-destruction. Lovecraft's genius was to keep these source texts fragmentary. We never read the Necronomicon directly. We read quotations from it, summaries of it, references to chapters that are never reproduced. This incompleteness is essential. A complete taxonomy of the mythos would be falsifiable. You could check it for contradictions, close the gaps, master the system. By keeping the source text perpetually partial, Lovecraft ensured that the hierarchy always extended beyond what any reader could fully map. There was always another entity, another relationship, another level of power implied but never confirmed. The darkness at the edge of the taxonomy is part of the taxonomy. The collaborative dimension of Lovecraft's circle intensified this effect enormously. When Clark Ashton Smith set a story in Hyperborea and mentioned Tsathoggua alongside Lovecraft's entities, or when Robert E. Howard had a character consult the Necronomicon in a Conan story, the fictional universe gained the texture of independent corroboration. Multiple witnesses were now reporting consistent details about the same cosmic hierarchy. This is exactly how real mythologies accrue authority, through independent attestation across sources. The Lovecraft Circle, perhaps without fully realizing it, replicated the mechanism by which religious traditions build credibility, applying it to a fictional system that denied the possibility of meaning. August Derleth's contribution to this process was paradoxical. On one hand, his systematization, the elemental correspondences, the elder gods, the explicit good versus evil framework, gave the mythos a legibility it had never possessed. It became possible, for the first time, to draw a chart. Great old ones here, outer gods there, elder gods as benevolent opposition. Readers who had been lost in Lovecraft's deliberate fog suddenly had a map. On the other hand, the map was a betrayal. Lovecraft's cosmos was specifically designed to resist mapping. Derleth's imposition of moral order, the idea that there were good cosmic entities opposing the bad ones, reintroduced the very theological framework that Lovecraft's entire project existed to demolish. The ranking became more structured, but philosophically thinner. This is a tension that every subsequent attempt to rank mythos entities has inherited, including this one. The final transformation came with the migration of the mythos into game systems and digital culture. Sandy Peterson's Call of Cthulhu, RPG, did not merely rank the entities, it quantified them. Cthulhu's statistics in the original 1981 rulebook are instructive. 21 points of armor, 160 hit points, a sanity loss of 1d10 over 1d100 on sight. Azathoth, by contrast, is essentially unstatted. Encountering Azathoth means the game is over. The character sheet is irrelevant. The dice no longer matter. The game thus encoded something Lovecraft had only implied, that the highest tier entities transcend the system designed to contain them. When a tabletop game tells you that the rules no longer apply, it is making a profoundly Lovecraftian statement in an unlikely medium. From Lovecraft's fragments, through Derleth's charts, to Peterson's stat blocks, to the fan wikis and tier lists that now populate every corner of the internet, the impulse has been consistent: order the unorderable. The authenticity of the mythos has survived every attempt at systematization, precisely because its core entities are defined by excess. They always overflow whatever container we build for them. That overflow is what we are tracking as we move into the heart of this ranking. The question is not whether our framework will prove adequate. It will not. The question is what its failures will teach us. Every monster ranking, from dragons to kaiju, operates on a shared assumption. Power means the ability to destroy. More destruction equals higher rank. Cosmic horror breaks this assumption so completely that we need to establish different terms before proceeding. In Lovecraft's philosophical framework, the most powerful force in the universe is not the one that destroys the most. It is the one that renders the concept of destruction meaningless. Destruction implies something valued being taken away. The deepest cosmic horror suggests there was nothing of value to begin with. This is the principle of cosmic indifference, and it functions as the gravitational constant of the mythos. The entities we are ranking do not hate humanity. Hatred would require attention, and attention would imply significance. They are not adversaries. An adversary acknowledges your existence as a precondition of opposing it. The great old ones and outer gods simply are, in the way that tectonic plates or gamma-ray bursts simply are, and their interaction with human life is incidental, accidental, and unremarkable from their perspective. When we say that Azathoth is more powerful than Cthulhu, we are partly saying that Azathoth is more indifferent than Cthulhu, that it occupies a register of existence where even the concept of noticing humanity has no meaning. Scale is the second operating principle. Cosmic horror achieves its effects through what might be called ontological vertigo, the nausea produced by confronting something so vast that it redefines what vastness means. Our ranking will move through several escalating registers of scale, and it is worth naming them explicitly. The first is planetary, entities whose scope is bounded by Earth or a single world. Deep Ones, Shoggoths, and most servitor races operate here. The second is stellar, entities whose influence extends across solar systems or galaxies. Cthulhu, with his psychic reach across interstellar distances, operates at this level. The third is dimensional, entities that exist across multiple planes of reality simultaneously. Yog-Sothoth, coterminous with all of space-time, is the exemplar. The fourth and highest is reality structural, entities that are not inhabitants of reality but conditions of it. Azathoth, whose dreaming may constitute existence itself, operates here. Each tier renders the one below it trivially insignificant. The third principle is the instability of reality itself. Many mythos entities exist in states where the distinction between dreaming and waking, between thought and matter, between symbol and referent, has collapsed. The dreamlands in Lovecraft's fiction are not metaphorical. They are a literal parallel reality accessible through sleep, populated by its own gods and governed by its own physics. Several entities, Nyarlathotep, Hypnos, the great ones of the dreamlands, move between waking reality and dream reality as though the boundary were permeable, which in the mythos it is. This matters for our ranking because it means that an entity's power cannot be assessed solely by what it does in physical space. Cthulhu's psychic influence over dreamers, exerted while he lies dead, but dreaming in Arlaya, may be more significant than any physical manifestation. The fourth principle is entropy, the thermodynamic tendency of all systems toward disorder and dissolution. Several mythos entities embody this tendency directly. Azathoth, as nuclear chaos, is entropy personified at the cosmic scale. The unnamed darkness at the edges of the mythos suggests a final state toward which all reality is heading. Formlessness, purposelessness, the heat death of meaning itself. When we rank an entity highly because it represents entropy, we are acknowledging something disturbing. The most powerful force in the mythos may simply be the direction the universe is already going. These entities are not threats from outside reality. They are reality's destination. There is a fifth principle that governs everything we are about to do, and it is the most uncomfortable one. Forbidden knowledge in the mythos is not merely dangerous in the way that classified military information is dangerous. It is ontologically corrosive. Learning about these entities does not give you power over them. It gives them access to you. The Necronomicon is not a weapon. It is a window, and windows work in both directions. This means that our ranking is itself, within the logic of the fiction, a dangerous act. Each entity we examine, each name we speak, each relationship we map, theoretically deepens our exposure. This is, of course, a literary conceit, but it is also the operating philosophy of the mythos, and ignoring it would mean ignoring the system we are trying to analyze. We now arrive at the ranking itself. It will be structured in 5 tiers, ascending from the most bounded entities to the most absolute. A word of method. Placement is determined not by any single metric, but by a composite of 4 factors. Ontological status, what level of reality the entity occupies. Narrative weight, how much a story bends around the entity when it appears. Epistemic damage, what knowing about the entity does to human minds. And cosmic scope, the implied extent of the entity's domain. An entity can score highly on one axis and lower on another, so these placements involve judgment. They are argued positions, not settled facts. Tier 5, heralds, servitors, and terrestrial horrors. These are the entities most grounded in physical reality, and therefore the most comprehensible. The deep ones are perhaps the most recognizable. Lovecraft's amphibious humanoids, first described in The Shadow over Innsmouth in 1931, who interbreed with coastal human populations and worship Dagon and Cthulhu. Their horror is primarily biological, the corruption of the human form, the revelation that your genealogy includes something inhuman. They are powerful collectively. They have civilizations, armies, cities beneath the sea. But individually, they are mortal, killable, and bounded by physical law. They belong in any mythos ranking, but they belong at the bottom. The Shoggoths sit above them, originally created as biological servitors by the Elder Things, as described in At the Mountains of Madness. Shoggoths are protoplasmic, shape-shifting, nearly indestructible, and, crucially, capable of revolt against their creators. Their horror is technological, tools that exceed the intelligence of their makers. A Shoggoth is perhaps the most physically dangerous entity in the lower tiers, able to mimic, absorb, and overwhelm almost any biological opponent. But they lack cosmic scope. They are confined to material reality and driven by something resembling animal intelligence. Fearsome, but finite. The Mygo, or fungi from Yuggoth, represent a different kind of lower-tier threat. These interstellar beings, introduced in The Whisperer in Darkness in 1931, possess advanced technology, including the ability to extract human brains and transport them in metal canisters across space. Their horror is surgical, intellectual, the reduction of human consciousness to portable hardware. They are interstellar, in range and vastly more technologically advanced than humanity. But they are still material beings with comprehensible motives: mining, research, territorial expansion. They can be reasoned with, bargained with, and potentially resisted. This places them firmly in Tier 5. Tier 4, Great Old Ones of planetary to stellar scope. Here we encounter the entities that most people think of when they hear cosmic horror monsters. The beings that are worshipped as gods by human and inhuman cults, that sleep beneath the earth or the sea or in distant star systems, and whose awakening would mean catastrophe on a civilizational scale. Dagon, the vast oceanic entity who may be the largest or oldest of the deep ones, or maybe something else entirely, sits at the lower end of this tier. He is worshipped, he is enormous, and he commands an aquatic empire, but his scope appears to be planetary. Hastur occupies a more complex position, originating not with Lovecraft but with Ambrose Bierce and Robert W. Chambers. Hastur exists in the mythos as a kind of artistic and mimetic threat. The play The King in Yellow, a fictional text within a text whose second act drives readers mad, is Hastur's primary weapon. His power is informational rather than physical, operating through cultural artifacts rather than tentacles. This makes him difficult to rank by conventional metrics, but profoundly effective by epistemic ones. Hastur destroys minds not through psychic assault, but through art. There is something uniquely terrifying about an entity whose primary vector is a theater performance. Cthulhu demands extended treatment, and he will receive it in Part 3. For now, his placement, solidly mid to upper Tier 4. He is the most famous entity in the mythos, the one with the largest cultural footprint, and the one most commonly assumed to be the most powerful. He is not. Cthulhu is a great old one, a category below the outer gods in every post-Lovecraft taxonomy. He is a priest of the outer gods, according to some readings, not a peer. His power is immense: global psychic influence, physical near indestructibility, the command of vast cults, but he is bounded. He sleeps. He can be temporarily dispersed. He waits for external conditions, when the stars are right, to fully manifest. These are constraints. The entities above him have none. Tier 3, Greater Old Ones and Liminal Powers. This tier contains entities that blur the line between the Great Old Ones and the outer gods, beings of immense age and power whose scope extends beyond any single planet, but who remain, in some sense, localized or dormant. Tsathoggua, Clark Ashton Smith's toad-like god of Nakai, is exemplary. He is older than most entities in the mythos, predating humanity and possibly predating Earth's current biosphere. But his defining trait is apathy. He is supremely powerful and supremely uninterested in exercising that power. This makes him a fascinating test case. Does unused power count in a ranking? Azathoth, the source of uncleanliness, and Yog-Sothoth, the unbegotten source, both occupy this tier as well. These are primordial generative entities, beings that continuously spawn lesser life forms in an unending, mindless process of biological creation. Their power is not destructive, but fecund. They are cosmic factories producing horrors as byproduct. Their ranking reflects a particular kind of cosmic power, the inability to stop creating, even when creation serves no purpose. Tier 2. Outer gods of reality, warping scope. We now cross a threshold. The entities in tiers 5 through 3, however vast and terrible, are inhabitants of reality. They exist within space-time, however uncomfortably. The outer gods are different. They are not in the universe in the way that a planet is in the universe. They are conditions of the universe, structural features of reality itself, or forces so fundamental that the distinction between entity and natural law becomes meaningless. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, embodies fertility and biological creation at a cosmic scale. Where Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth spawn mindlessly in subterranean pools, Shub-Niggurath is the principle of spawning, the reproductive drive of the cosmos made divine. Her 1,000 young are not a specific number, but an indication of limitless generative capacity. She is worshipped across multiple species and worlds, and her cults are among the most widespread in the mythos. Her power is the power of biological persistence, life that will not stop propagating, regardless of whether it should. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, is unique among the outer gods and unique in this entire ranking. He is the only entity of cosmic scope who appears to possess genuine personality, intelligence, and, most disturbing, interest in humanity. Lovecraft described him as the soul and messenger of the outer gods. He has 1,000 forms, from the tall dark man of witch, cults to the monstrous haunter of the dark, to the pharaonic figure of his earliest 1920 appearance. He manipulates, deceives, orchestrates apocalypses, and appears to enjoy the suffering he causes. This raises a profound question for our ranking. Is Nyarlathotep more or less powerful than entities that do not deign to interact with lesser beings? His engagement with humanity could be read as a limitation. A truly supreme being would not bother, or as the most terrifying demonstration of power imaginable, a god who is not indifferent, who chooses to be cruel. Yog-Sothoth, the key and the gate, occupies the upper reaches of Tier 2, and arguably contests the apex position with Azathoth itself. Lovecraft described Yog-Sothoth as coterminous with all of space and time, not merely present everywhere, but constitutive of everywhere. He is the fabric of the space-time continuum, the boundary between dimensions, and the mechanism by which any movement between realms is possible. In Piyun, through the gates of the Silver Key, Randolph Carter's encounter with Yog-Sothoth reveals an entity that does not inhabit the universe, but is the universe's architecture. Omniscient by nature, since knowing all of space-time means knowing everything that has ever happened or will happen, Yog-Sothoth's power is structural rather than active. He does not destroy, he contains. Tier 1, the Absolute, Azathoth, the blind idiot god, the nuclear chaos, the demon sultan who sits at the center of ultimate chaos, lulled by the thin monotonous piping of accursed flutes. Lovecraft's ultimate entity is the ultimate negation, a being of presumably infinite power that possesses no mind, no will, no awareness, and no purpose. The universe may be Azathoth's dream, a proposition suggested but never confirmed in the mythos, and if so, every other entity in this ranking exists within Azathoth's unconscious, as elements of a dream being dreamed by something that does not know it is dreaming. Waking Azathoth, or the cessation of its dreaming, would presumably mean the annihilation of all reality. This is, by any measure, the highest power level conceivable. And yet it comes with a devastating qualification. Azathoth has no intent. It cannot choose to exercise its power. It is not asleep by choice. It is not dreaming deliberately. It is a blind engine of reality generation, and the universe it sustains is an accident. To place Azathoth at the top of the ranking is to declare that the most powerful force in cosmic horror is one that does not know it is powerful. That power, at its most absolute, is indistinguishable from purposelessness. There are faint suggestions in Lovecraft's genealogical notes and in later mythos fiction of entities or principles that exist alongside or even beyond Azathoth. The nameless mist, the darkness, the concept of the ultimate void. These are barely sketched, more theological abstractions than characters, but their existence raises a final, vertiginous possibility that the hierarchy does not end, that beyond Azathoth there is something else, and beyond that something else, and that the chain of cosmic power extends infinitely upward into a darkness that has no ceiling. We will leave that possibility open, because closing it would be a certainty the mythos does not permit. There is a practical question embedded in any power ranking of cosmic entities. What happens when a human being actually encounters one? In the mythos, the answer is remarkably consistent, and it scales with the entity's tier. Madness is not a side effect of encountering these beings. It is the primary effect, the function of the encounter, the thing the narrative is designed to produce. Understanding how madness operates across the tiers is essential to understanding why we rank these entities as we do. At the lowest tiers, the human response is fear, physiological, comprehensible, survivable. A sailor who sees a deep one rising from the water experiences terror, revulsion, perhaps lasting trauma, but the framework of his understanding remains intact. He still knows what he is, where he is, and what real means. He has seen a monster. His world is darker, but it is still recognizable as a world. This is conventional horror, operating within the boundaries of ordinary psychology. The encounter is terrible. The mind endures. At the mid-tiers, the great old ones, the response shifts from fear to something more corrosive, existential crisis. The narrator of The Call of Cthulhu does not simply fear Cthulhu. He realizes that the existence of Cthulhu invalidates the entire framework of human civilization. Science, religion, history, philosophy, all of them assume a universe in which humanity matters. Cthulhu's existence proves otherwise. The madness that follows is not clinical insanity in any psychiatric sense. It is the collapse of meaning, the sudden, irrecoverable recognition that the conceptual structures you have relied on your entire life are parochial fictions with no cosmic validity. This is a qualitatively different form of damage than fear. You can recover from fear. You cannot unknow insignificance. At the upper tiers, the outer gods, the response escalates beyond existential crisis into what we might call cognitive dissolution. This is not the loss of a framework, but the loss of the capacity for framework. Encountering Yog-Sothoth, as Randolph Carter does in Through the Gates of the Silver Key, does not produce madness in the sense of delusion or irrationality. It produces a state in which the categories of sane and insane no longer apply, because those categories depend on a stable distinction between self and world, subject and object, that the encounter has dissolved. Carter does not go mad. He becomes something else, something that can no longer be evaluated by human psychological standards, because it is no longer operating within human psychology. The cults that form around these entities provide an additional data point for the ranking. The nature of worship reflects the nature of the worshipped. Cthulhu's cults are organized, fervent, and purposeful. They perform rituals, maintain lineages, pursue specific eschatological goals. This suggests an entity that still functions as an object of devotion, a being that can be prayed to and might, in some sense, respond. Shub-Niggurath's worship involves orgiastic fertility rites, ecstatic, biological, driven by the body rather than the intellect. Nyarlathotep's cults are manipulated and instrumentalized by the god himself. He appears among his worshippers, directs them, uses them. These are all recognizable forms of religious behavior, however distorted. Azathoth's worship, by contrast, is described as mindless piping and drumming, sound without content, ritual without purpose, worship without an object capable of receiving it. The cult mirrors the god. Where the god is mindless, the worship is meaningless. This is the furthest point cult behavior can reach, and it marks the top of the hierarchy. One final observation about the madness function. In the mythos, even indirect contact with higher-tier entities produces effects proportional to their power. Reading about Cthulhu in the Necronomicon produces nightmares. Seeing a sigil associated with Nyarlathotep produces obsession. Hearing the piping associated with Azathoth produces a desire to join the mindless dance. The documentary we are constructing is, within the fiction's logic, a low-level exposure event. We are cataloging names, describing attributes, mapping relationships, all activities that Lovecraft's narrators perform immediately before their sanity gives way. This is the recursive trap at the center of the mythos. The knowledge you need to understand the hierarchy is the same knowledge that the hierarchy uses to destroy you. The ranking we have constructed in the previous section rests on knowledge, specific claims about specific entities organized into a legible system. Within the mythos, this is exactly the kind of activity that gets people killed, driven mad, or worse. We should examine why, because the epistemology of cosmic horror, its theory of what knowledge is and what it does, is inseparable from its power structure. In most intellectual traditions, knowledge is empowering. You learn about a threat in order to counter it. You study a system in order to master it. The mythos inverts this completely. Knowledge of higher-tier entities does not give the knower any advantage. It gives the entities access to the knower. The Necronomicon is the paradigmatic example, a text that describes cosmic beings in sufficient detail to make them, in some functional sense, aware of the reader. The book is not a weapon in the reader's hand. It is a window that opens in both directions. And the things on the other side of the window are larger, older, and more patient than anything on this side. This bidirectional quality of forbidden knowledge has specific implications for our ranking. Lower-tier entities can be studied with relative safety. Marine biologists could hypothetically Research the deep ones without losing their minds. The information is disturbing, but cognitively manageable. Research into mid-tier entities begins to carry genuine epistemic risk. The scholar who devotes years to reconstructing Cthulhu's cult practices finds their dreams changing, their sense of scale shifting, their confidence in human significance eroding. This is not supernatural punishment. It is the natural consequence of sustained exposure to ideas that are fundamentally incompatible with psychological stability. At the highest tiers, the relationship between knower and known collapses entirely. To truly comprehend Yog-Sothoth, to understand what it means for an entity to be coterminous with all of space-time, would require a cognitive apparatus capable of processing infinite simultaneous perspectives. The human mind cannot do this. The attempt does not produce madness in the clinical sense, but something more radical, the dissolution of the boundary between the mind doing the knowing and the entity being known. In Through the Gates of the Silver Key, Carter's encounter with Yog-Sothoth results in his identity fracturing across multiple bodies and time periods. He does not learn about Yog-Sothoth. He begins, partially and irreversibly, to become Yog-Sothoth. Knowledge and transformation are the same event. This epistemic structure creates what we might call a taxonomic paradox. The more accurately you rank these entities, the more dangerous the ranking becomes, not because powerful people will suppress your findings, but because the findings themselves are ontologically active. A perfect ranking of cosmic horror entities would be, in the logic of the mythos, a perfect interface with those entities. It would be the Necronomicon. Our ranking is thankfully imperfect, limited by human cognition, distorted by literary interpretation, bounded by the incompleteness of the source material. These imperfections are not bugs. They are the margin of safety that keeps the project viable. There is a philosophical dimension here that extends beyond the fiction. The mythos dramatizes a real epistemological anxiety, the fear that some truths are inherently destructive to the knower. This is not unique to Lovecraft. Nuclear physics carries a version of this anxiety, knowledge that enables the destruction of the knower's entire civilization. Artificial intelligence research carries another version, knowledge that might produce intelligences that render the knower species obsolete. Lovecraft's contribution was to push this anxiety to its absolute limit. What if the most fundamental truths about the nature of reality are incompatible with human sanity? What if accurate cosmology is literally maddening? Our ranking then occupies a peculiar position. It is an attempt to organize knowledge that, within its own fictional framework, resists organization and punishes the organizer. Every tier we establish, every entity we place, every relationship we map is simultaneously an act of scholarship and an act of hubris. The mythos is designed to make taxonomy feel brave and foolish in equal measure. We proceed anyway, because the alternative is silence, and silence in cosmic horror is just another word for the void. The entities we ranked in Part 2 did not arrive fully formed. They accumulated across decades of fiction, each story adding a fragment, a contradiction, a new implication that shifted the relationships between beings already established. Tracing the order of their literary appearance reveals something important. The hierarchy we now take for granted was never planned. It emerged, story by story, through a process closer to geological sedimentation than architectural design. Lovecraft's earliest relevant work, Dagon, was written in 1917 and published in 1919. It is a slight story, barely 2,000 words, about a shipwrecked sailor who encounters a monolithic structure on a newly risen island and glimpses of vast aquatic creature worshipping at it. There is no cosmology here, no hierarchy. There is only the encounter, a human confronting something enormous, ancient, and incomprehensible. Dagon, as an entity, is barely characterized. He is large. He is worshipped. He is connected to the deep ocean. The story's power lies entirely in the narrator's response, his psychological disintegration, his eventual suicide. The monster is almost incidental. This pattern would persist throughout Lovecraft's career. The entities matter less for what they are than for what they do to the people who encounter them. Nyarlathotep, published in 1920, represents a radical departure. Written in a dreamlike, semi-automatic prose that Lovecraft claimed was inspired by an actual nightmare, the piece presents its titular entity as a figure of seductive menace. A tall, swarthy man who demonstrates strange technologies to fascinated crowds, leading them ultimately into chaos and dissolution. There are no tentacles, no impossible geometries. Nyarlathotep is social, charismatic, and deliberately cruel. He is also, already in this first appearance, clearly different in kind from Dagon. Where Dagon is a brute presence, Nyarlathotep is an intelligence, a manipulator. The seed of the hierarchy is planted here. Some cosmic entities are mindless forces. Others have agendas. The Nameless City, in 1921, introduced Abdul al-Hazred and the famous Necronomicon couplet, "That is not dead, which can eternal lie. And with strange aeons, even death may die," establishing the concept of cosmic entities that transcend death itself. The Hound, in 1922, mentioned the Necronomicon by name for the first time. The Festival, in 1923, quoted from it directly. Each reference thickened the fictional world, suggesting depths of accumulated knowledge about these beings that no single story could contain. The entities were being documented before many of them had even appeared in the fiction. The bibliography preceded the bestiary. The critical year was 1928. The Call of Cthulhu introduced the most famous entity in cosmic horror, and crucially, the first explicit suggestion of a hierarchical cosmic structure. The story's cultists speak of great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who came from the sky to rule the young earth. They worship Cthulhu as a kind of priest or intermediary, a high figure, certainly, but one who serves something higher still. The phrase, "the great old ones," established a category, and categories imply relations. If there are great old ones, there may be greater old ones, or something else entirely above them. The Dunwich Horror, in 1929, confirmed this suspicion by introducing Yog-Sothoth as an entity of explicitly higher order than anything previously described. At the Mountains of Madness, in 1931, complicated the hierarchy from below, revealing the elder things, beings of vast technological accomplishment who had nonetheless been overthrown by their own Shoggoth servitors and who regarded Cthulhu's spawn as relatively recent arrivals. The Dreams in the Witch House, in 1933, placed Nyarlathotep in the role of cosmic intermediary, appearing at the witch Keziah Mason's sabbats as the black man of folk tradition. The Shadow Out of Time, in 1936, introduced the great race of Yith, who had escaped their own dying world by projecting their minds across time, adding temporal displacement to the already dizzying array of cosmic capabilities. Each story expanded the implied hierarchy without ever making it explicit. The cross-pollination with other writers deepened the effect exponentially. Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborean cycle, published throughout the early 1930s, introduced Tsathoggua, an entity older and lazier than Cthulhu, worshipped in prehistoric Greenland before sinking into subterranean slumber. Smith also contributed Ubosathla, the primordial source of all earthly life, and Abhoth, a ceaselessly spawning abomination dwelling beneath Mount Vormithidreth. Robert E. Howard wove mythos references into his Conan stories, grounding cosmic horror in pulp adventure, and suggesting that these entities could be encountered and survived by sufficiently determined warriors. Frank Belknap Long's The Hounds of Tindalos in 1929 added angular, time-traveling predators that hunt through the geometry of curved versus angled space. Each contribution was a new data point in an increasingly complex web of cosmic relationships, and each implicitly raised the question, where does this new entity sit relative to the others? By the time of Lovecraft's death in 1937, the raw material for a ranked hierarchy existed. Dozens of entities, scattered across dozens of stories by half a dozen authors, connected by shared references, overlapping geographies, and a common philosophical sensibility. What did not exist was the hierarchy itself. That would require someone willing to impose order on what Lovecraft had deliberately left disordered. A task that would begin almost immediately and continue, with increasing urgency and decreasing fidelity for the next 9 decades. The Call of Cthulhu is the most analyzed story in the Lovecraftian canon, and for good reason. It is the text that most directly addresses the question of what happens when a cosmic entity intersects with human awareness. It is also the text most commonly used to argue that Cthulhu is the apex predator of the mythos, an argument that, as we will see, the story itself actually undermines. The narrative structure is tripartite, and each section reveals a different register of Cthulhu's power. The first section, The Horror in Clay, concerns the papers of the recently deceased Professor Angel, which document AEI's series of disturbing incidents. A young sculptor, Henry Wilcox, produces a bas-relief of an entity he has seen in dreams. Simultaneously, sensitive individuals across the globe experience nightmares. Artists produce disturbing work, and asylum populations spike. This is Cthulhu's psychic register, his influence over human minds exerted from beneath the Pacific Ocean while sleeping. The geographical range is global. The mechanism is involuntary dream invasion. The implication is staggering. An unconscious entity imprisoned in a sunken city can reach every sensitive mind on the planet simultaneously without effort or intent. As a demonstration of power, this exceeds anything shown by lower-tier entities by orders of magnitude. The second section, The Tale of Inspector Legrasse, extends the power demonstration into the social register. Legrasse's 1908 encounter with a Cthulhu cult in the Louisiana swamps reveals a global network of worshippers, isolated groups in Greenland, the Haasan, Pacific Islands, West Africa, and the American South, all maintaining the same rituals, the same iconography, the same chant, with no apparent contact between them. Cthulhu's power here is not psychic, but organizational, though not in a managerial sense. The cult spontaneously maintains coherence across continents and centuries because the psychic signal is strong enough to produce convergent religious behavior in independent populations. This is a power that religious scholars would recognize: the capacity to generate worship without revelation, to create liturgy without prophets, to sustain a global church through dreams alone. The third section, The madness from the sea provides the physical encounter and the evidence most often cited by those who wish to diminish Cthulhu's ranking. The Norwegian sailor Johansen and the crew of the Emma encounter Relie, the risen city, and Cthulhu emerges from his tomb. The description is famously disorienting. A mountain walked, or stumbled, a green sticky spawn of the stars. And Johansen's response is to ram his ship, the Alert, directly into the entity's head. Cthulhu's head bursts apart, reforming almost instantly as the ship passes through, but the entity does not pursue the fleeing vessel. Relie sinks again. Cthulhu returns to sleep. This scene has launched decades of debate. The most common reading: Cthulhu was hurt by a boat, therefore Cthulhu is not very powerful. The more careful reading: Cthulhu was not fully awakened, the stars were not yet right, and what Johansen encountered was a fraction of the entity's capacity, something like an arm reaching drowsily from beneath the covers before the sleeper rolls over. The text supports this. Cthulhu reforms immediately. Relie sinks, not because Cthulhu was defeated, but because the cosmic conditions for his full emergence had not been met. The boat did not defeat Cthulhu. It briefly disrupted an incomplete manifestation of a being that was already returning to dormancy for reasons entirely unrelated to human action. What the Call of Cthulhu actually demonstrates, when read as power-ranking evidence, is this. Cthulhu is immensely powerful within his register. His psychic range is planetary. His cult influence spans millennia, and his physical form is effectively indestructible under normal conditions. But he is also constrained. He sleeps. He requires specific stellar alignments to act. He is described as a priest of higher entities, not a supreme being himself. The story's narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, ends his account with the recognition that Cthulhu is merely the most accessible representative of something far worse, a sentiment captured in the story's closing paragraph, where Thurston speculates about what else might be waiting behind the walls of the world. This is the key insight for our ranking. Cthulhu occupies the position he does, mid to upper tier 4, precisely because he is the cosmic entity most directly engaged with humanity. He dreams at us. He accepts worship. He can be physically encountered, however briefly. The entities ranked above him are less accessible, less narratively present, and less culturally famous. But this inaccessibility is itself evidence of superior power. Cthulhu is the threshold entity, the last point on the hierarchy where human interaction is still meaningfully possible. Above him, the entities become progressively more abstract, more indifferent, and more terrifying. He is the most powerful monster we can still tell a story about. The ones above him break the story. If Cthulhu is the mythos entity most suited to narrative, a being you can encounter, flee from, and survive to report on, then Yog-Sothoth is the entity that most thoroughly resists narrative. And this resistance is itself the strongest evidence for his placement near the apex of the hierarchy. Yog-Sothoth appears in multiple Lovecraft stories, each revealing a different facet of an entity so vast that no single text can contain it. Taken together, these appearances construct a portrait of something that is less a character than a condition of existence. The Dunwich Horror, published in 1929, provides the most visceral demonstration of Yog-Sothoth's power, although the entity himself never directly appears. The story concerns the Whately family of Dunwich, Massachusetts, specifically Lavinia Whately and her twin sons, fathered by Yog-Sothoth through a ritual described only in the vaguest terms. One twin, Wilbur, is outwardly human, but inwardly monstrous, growing at an accelerated rate and seeking to acquire the Necronomicon from Miskatonic University. The other twin is invisible, formless, and enormous, a thing that grows within the Whately farmhouse until it breaks free and devastates the countryside. The invisible twin is described, when finally made partially visible through an incantation, as a mass of writhing, ropey appendages that defies coherent description. The horror of the Dunwich Horror is not the visible destruction, but its implication. Yog-Sothoth did not invade our dimension through a portal or an alignment. He reproduced into it. A fragment of Yog-Sothoth was incarnated through a human woman, producing offspring that are hybrids of cosmic entity and terrestrial biology. This demonstrates a power qualitatively different from Cthulhu's psychic influence or physical emergence. Yog-Sothoth can interpenetrate our reality at the biological level, embedding himself in human genetics. The Whately twins are not servants or cultists. They are extensions of Yog-Sothoth, material protrusions of an extra-dimensional entity into three-dimensional space. If Cthulhu's power is to influence our minds, Yog-Sothoth's power is to colonize our matter. Through the Gates of the Silver Key, a 1934 collaboration between Lovecraft and E. Hoffman Price, provides the cosmological dimension. Randolph Carter, Lovecraft's recurring dreamer protagonist, passes through a series of dimensional gates and encounters Yog-Sothoth directly, or rather, encounters the impossibility of encountering Yog-Sothoth directly. The entity is described as coterminous with all of space and time, not merely omnipresent, but constitutive of presence itself. He is the gate and the key. He is the boundary between dimensions, the structure of the multiverse, the architecture through which any movement between any two points in space-time must pass. Carter does not see Yog-Sothoth. He realizes that everything he has ever seen has been inside Yog-Sothoth. This revelation changes the nature of our ranking entirely. If Yog-Sothoth is the structure of space-time, then placing him in a hierarchy is like placing the laws of physics in a hierarchy. They are not in the system. They are the system. Every entity ranked below Yog-Sothoth exists within the dimensional framework that Yog-Sothoth either constitutes or controls. Cthulhu sleeps in a specific location, Ar-Liye, beneath the Pacific. Nyarlathotep moves between specific locations. Shub-Niggurath breeds in specific places. All of them operate within space and time. Yog-Sothoth is space and time. The only entity that might exceed this scope is Azathoth, and the relationship between Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth represents the deepest unresolved question in mythos cosmology. Lovecraft's genealogical notes, fragmentary, unpublished during his lifetime, and possibly never intended as definitive canon, suggest that Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth are related. In one sketch, the nameless mist, an emanation of Azathoth, produces Yog-Sothoth, who in turn produces other entities. If this genealogy is taken literally, Azathoth is Yog-Sothoth's ultimate progenitor, the source from which the architecture of space-time emerged. Azathoth dreamed, and the dream crystallized into the structure we call Yog-Sothoth, which in turn became the framework within which everything else exists. This would place Azathoth definitively above Yog-Sothoth. The dreamer outranks the dream's architecture. But this reading is far from settled. Another interpretation holds that Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth represent different modalities of the same ultimate principle: chaos and order, energy and structure, the nuclear fire, and the geometry it produces. Under this reading, neither outranks the other. They are complementary aspects of a reality that requires both formlessness and form to exist. The piping chaos at the center of infinity and the omniscient gate that connects all points in space-time are two faces of the same coin. This interpretation makes the apex of our hierarchy not a single entity, but a dyad, an unresolved tension between raw power and structural omniscience that cannot be collapsed into a simple ranking. We leave this tension unresolved, as Lovecraft did. The literary evidence supports both readings, and the ambiguity is not a flaw in the mythos, but its deepest feature. The most powerful entities in cosmic horror are the ones whose relative positions cannot be definitively established, because definitive establishment would imply a stable, knowable order, and the entire point of these entities is that no such order exists. Lovecraft died on March 15, 1937, leaving behind a body of work that was philosophically coherent, but deliberately unsystematic. What happened next is a case study in what occurs when a fictional mythology passes from its creator to its inheritors. Some faithful, some revisionist, and some operating in media that Lovecraft could not have imagined. Each phase of inheritance reshaped the power hierarchy we have been examining, sometimes deepening it, sometimes flattening it, and always revealing the tension between cosmic horror's resistance to order and the human need to impose it. August Derleth moved first and left the deepest imprint. Through Arkham House, the publishing firm he co-founded in 1939, Derleth kept Lovecraft's work in print during decades when it might otherwise have vanished. His editorial contribution is beyond dispute. His creative contribution is more contentious. Derleth wrote dozens of stories that expanded the mythos, but his expansion followed a logic fundamentally at odds with Lovecraft's philosophy. He imposed elemental correspondences. Cthulhu was water, Cthulhu was fire, Ithaqua was air, Nyarlathotep was earth. He introduced the elder gods, benevolent cosmic entities, led by a being called Nodens, who actively opposed the great old ones. He reframed the mythos as a cosmic battle between good and evil, with humanity as a meaningful participant rather than an irrelevant bystander. For our ranking, Derleth's intervention created a paradox that persists to this day. On one hand, the elemental system and the elder god opposition made the hierarchy more legible. If Cthulhu is fire and Cthulhu is water, you can begin to imagine matchups, strengths, weaknesses. The grammar of a power ranking. Derleth made it possible to rank these entities in a structured way. On the other hand, the very features that enabled ranking undermined the philosophical foundation that made the entities terrifying. A Cthulhu who has a natural weakness, fire, supposedly, is a less powerful Cthulhu. An outer god who can be opposed by a benevolent elder god is diminished by the opposition. Derleth's system added structure at the cost of horror. Most subsequent mythos scholars, following S.T. Joshi's lead, have treated the Derleth editions as semi-canonical at best, useful for gaming and popular culture, but philosophically suspect. Ramsey Campbell and Brian Lumley represent two divergent post-Derleth trajectories. Campbell, beginning in the 1960s, added entities like Glaaki, a vast spiny slug god dwelling in a lake in the Severn Valley, who creates undead servitors through impalement on his spines, and Yigolonak, a headless, obese abomination associated with forbidden knowledge and depravity. Campbell's additions hewed closer to Lovecraft's philosophical sensibility. His entities are repulsive, incomprehensible, and indifferent. They slot into the existing hierarchy without disrupting its logic, generally occupying Tier 4 positions as localized Great Old Ones with specific domains and limited cosmic scope. Lumley took the opposite approach. His Titus Crow series, beginning with The Burrowers Beneath in 1974, featured protagonists who actively fought the mythos entities, and won. Crow uses elder god technology, explores alternate dimensions, and confronts great old ones as adversaries to be defeated rather than cosmic principles to be endured. This approach has vocal defenders. Lumley's work is entertaining and imaginative, but it fundamentally alters the power dynamics of the hierarchy. If Cthulhu can be fought by a sufficiently prepared human agent, then Cthulhu's power is not ontological, but merely physical, and the philosophical vertigo that defines cosmic horror is replaced by something closer to science fiction adventure. Lumley's contribution to the ranking is essentially deflationary. He made the lower tiers more accessible by making them more vulnerable. Thomas Ligotti represents the philosophical opposite, an author who pushed cosmic horror's implications further than Lovecraft himself. Ligotti's fiction, particularly the stories collected in Songs of a Dead Dreamer, 1986, and Grimscribe, 1991, and his philosophical treatise, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, largely dispense with named entities altogether. His horror is about the malignancy of existence itself, the proposition that consciousness is a mistake, that reality is a puppet show with no puppeteer, and that the kindest possible cosmology is one of absolute nothingness. Ligotti does not rank cosmic entities because, in his framework, the horror is not located in any particular being, but in the structure of being as such. His work suggests that the apex of our hierarchy should not be Azathoth, but the fact that anything exists at all. This is, in a sense, the logical endpoint of the ranking project. The most powerful cosmic horror is not a monster, but a metaphysical condition. The migration of the mythos into gaming deserves its own extended treatment. Sandy Peterson's Call of Cthulhu, tabletop RPG, first published by Chaosium in 1981, remains the most influential codification of the hierarchy. The game's sanity mechanic, characters lose sanity points upon encountering mythos entities, with the amount proportional to the entity's power, is an elegant formalization of what Lovecraft depicted narratively. Seeing a deep one costs 0 to 1d6 sanity points. Seeing Cthulhu costs 1d10 over 1d100. Encountering Azathoth is described as automatic, permanent, total insanity, no roll required. The game's designers understood something essential. In the mythos, power is best measured not by what an entity can destroy, but by what it does to the mind that perceives it. Later games like Exauskaskixadil elaborated and complicated this framework. Arkham Horror, 1987, revised 2005, introduced the concept of Ancient Ones as endgame threats with escalating difficulty levels. Bloodborne, 2015, may be the most artistically successful translation of the mythos hierarchy into interactive media, a game whose entire structure enacts an ascent through tiers of cosmic awareness, from beast-slaying to eldritch revelation to apotheosis. The player begins fighting werewolves and ends confronting beings that operate on a plane where the concept of fighting no longer applies. The game never names Lovecraft's specific entities, but its power hierarchy, from beasts to kin to great ones to the moon presence, is a faithful transposition of the tiered structure we have been analyzing. The contemporary mythos is vast, contradictory, and still expanding. Victor Laval's The Ballad of Black Tom, 2016, retold the horror at Red Hook from the perspective of a black protagonist, recasting the power hierarchy through the lens of racial oppression, suggesting that for marginalized communities, the most powerful cosmic force might be the indifference of a society that has already decided you do not matter. Ruthanna Emrys's Winter Tide, 2017, imagined Deep One communities surviving internment camps, reframing the lowest tier of our hierarchy as persecuted minorities. These revisionist readings do not replace the original hierarchy, but overlay it with new meaning, demonstrating that the ranking is not a fixed structure, but a lens that refracts differently, depending on who is looking through it. Something peculiar happens when a fictional mythology becomes sufficiently detailed, sufficiently internally consistent, and sufficiently distributed across multiple authors and media. People begin to treat it as real. This has happened with the Cthulhu Mythos to a degree that is unique in modern literary history. And the phenomenon tells us something important about why the impulse to rank these entities is so persistent and so psychologically charged. The Necronomicon provides the most striking case. Lovecraft invented the book, invented its author, Abdul al-Hazred, and invented its history. Composed in Damascus around 730 CE, translated into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228. He was explicit in his letters that the Necronomicon was fictional. It did not matter. By the 1970s, multiple real Necronomicons had been published, the most famous being the so-called Simon Necronomicon of 1977, a mass-market paperback combining Sumerian mythology, Aleister Crowley-derived occultism, and Lovecraftian window dressing into a functional grimoire that has reportedly sold over 1 million copies. The Simon Necronomicon includes rituals, incantations, and a hierarchical system of entities that draws directly on the mythos power structure. It treats the ranking as operational, something you need to understand in order to invoke the correct entities in the correct order without being destroyed. Library science provides an unexpectedly revealing angle on this phenomenon. Multiple university and public libraries have received requests for the Necronomicon over the decades. Some libraries, including the Widener Library at Harvard, the real-world counterpart of Lovecraft's Miskatonic University Library, have created catalog entries for the book as jokes or Easter eggs. Others have had to field serious inquiries from patrons who believed the book existed. The catalog entry is itself a kind of low-level reality bleed. The book is fictional, but it has a Library of Congress call number. The hierarchy of cosmic entities it describes is invented, but it is indexed. The phenomenon extends beyond texts to entities. The bloop, an ultra-low-frequency underwater sound detected by NOAA hydrophones in 1997, was almost immediately associated with Cthulhu by internet communities, partly because its point of origin was relatively close to Lovecraft's coordinates for Arlaya. NOAA eventually attributed the sound to icequake activity, but the Cthulhu interpretation persists in popular culture, not because anyone seriously believes in a sleeping alien god, but because the mythos provides a narrative framework for phenomena that are otherwise merely strange. The ranking is implicated here. The bloop is attributed to Cthulhu specifically, not to Dagon, not to a Deep One, not to a Shoggoth, because Cthulhu occupies the right position on the hierarchy. He is powerful enough to be an explanation for an oceanic anomaly, but accessible enough to be imagined as a physical presence in a specific location. Chaos magic provides the most philosophically interesting intersection of fictional hierarchy and real-world practice. Practitioners of chaos magic, a postmodern occult movement that emerged in the 1970s through the work of Peter Carroll and Phil Hine, operate on the principle that belief is a tool, not a commitment. The truth or falsehood of a magical system is irrelevant. What matters is whether it produces results when you act as though it is true. Chaos magicians have incorporated mythos entities into their practice with full awareness that these entities are fictional. Treating the hierarchy as a functional map of psychological forces rather than a description of supernatural beings. In this framework, invoking Nyarlathotep is a technique for accessing a specific state of consciousness, chaotic, deceptive, creative, while invoking Azathoth is a technique for confronting the dissolution of all mental structure. The power ranking becomes a navigational chart for altered states of awareness. The Slender Man phenomenon of the early 2000s demonstrated that the process Lovecraft initiated, collaborative fictional mythology to hierarchical systematization to reality bleed, can be replicated in compressed timeframes with digital tools. Slender Man was created in 2009 as a photographic hoax on the Something Awful forums. Within months, he had acquired a detailed mythology, a power set, and a hierarchical relationship to other creepypasta entities. Within 5 years, two 12-year-old girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin, stabbed a classmate in what they described as an attempt to appease him. The case is extreme and tragic, but it illustrates a principle directly relevant to our subject. When a fictional entity becomes sufficiently defined, when it has a name, a description, a place in a hierarchy of powers, it becomes psychologically available in ways that vague, unranked horrors are not. The ranking is part of the reification process. Giving an entity a position in a hierarchy makes it feel more real. This is the uncomfortable truth beneath the entire ranking enterprise. We rank these entities because ranking is how humans make things real to themselves. The act of saying Azathoth is more powerful than Cthulhu, who is more powerful than Dagon, is structurally identical to the act of saying Zeus is more powerful than Athena, who is more powerful than a river nymph. Both are exercises in mythological systematization, and both serve the same psychological function, making the cosmos feel organized, even when the organization points toward chaos. The mythos is uniquely suited to expose this mechanism, because its explicit philosophical content is that organization is an illusion. We rank the entities to make them comprehensible. Their entire purpose is to be incomprehensible. The tension never resolves. The Cthulhu mythos has been adapted into virtually every narrative and artistic medium that exists, and a striking pattern emerges when these adaptations are examined through the lens of our power ranking. The higher an entity sits on the hierarchy, the more difficult it becomes to adapt successfully, and the more indirect the successful adaptations tend to be. This pattern is not coincidental. It reflects something fundamental about the relationship between cosmic power and representability. Film has struggled most visibly with this problem. Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, 1985, and From Beyond, 1986, loosely adapted from Lovecraft stories, are effective horror films, but they operate almost exclusively at the lower tiers. Bodily horror, mad science, creatures that can be fought and sometimes defeated. They are Tier 5 cinema, servitors and terrestrial threats rendered with practical effects and darkly comic energy. The higher tier entities are mostly absent because film's visual grammar demands that things be shown, and the mythos entities derive their power precisely from their resistance to being shown. A Shoggoth can be a special effect. Cthulhu can be a silhouette, a shadow, a half-glimpsed shape in fog. Azathoth cannot be shown at all without diminishing it, because any visual representation imposes form on something defined by formlessness. The most successful Lovecraftian films have understood this and worked around it. Richard Stanley's Color Out of Space, 2019, adapted from one of Lovecraft's most atmospheric stories, depicts an entity, the color, that has no shape, no body, no face. It manifests as a tint, a shimmer, a wrongness in the light. It cannot be fought because there is nothing to fight. Nicolas Cage's escalating madness in the film mirrors the mid-tier encounter gradient. Not confrontation with a monster, but dissolution of the boundary between self and environment. The film works because it stays in the range of the hierarchy where visual storytelling is still possible. The entity has effects that can be photographed, even if the entity itself cannot. Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, while not explicitly Lovecraftian, may be the most effective cinematic rendering of upper-tier cosmic horror produced to date. The Shimmer, an expanding zone where biological and physical laws are rewritten, functions as a visual metaphor for an encounter with something that operates at the reality structural level. The film's climax, in which the protagonist confronts a humanoid entity that mirrors and absorbs her, captures the Yog-Sothothian dissolution of boundaries between self and other without ever naming a mythos entity. The adaptation succeeds by translating the philosophical content rather than the specific mythology. Video games have arguably surpassed film as the medium best suited to the mythos hierarchy, because games can make the player experience escalating tiers of cosmic awareness rather than merely observe them. Bloodborne, 2015, is the landmark achievement. Developed by From Software, the game begins as gothic horror, werewolves, villagers, blood plagues, and gradually reveals that the entire setting is under the influence of cosmic entities called Great Ones. The player's character accumulates insight, a stat that literally changes what is visible on screen. With enough insight, creatures that were previously invisible become apparent, architectural features shift, and the game's very aesthetic transforms from Victorian horror to Eldritch nightmare. This mechanic is a direct implementation of the mythos encounter gradient. Power is measured not by what an entity can do to you physically, but by the threshold of perception required to become aware of it. The final bosses are not the strongest fighters, but the most alien. Entities whose visual design communicates that you have left the realm of comprehensible threat and entered something categorically different. Darkest Dungeon, 2016, explored a different dimension of the hierarchy, the psychological cost of sustained exposure. The game's stress mechanic, heroes accumulate psychological damage through encounters with eldritch horrors, eventually developing afflictions that impair their function, is a systems-level translation of Lovecraft's madness gradient. Lesser enemies cause manageable stress. Mid-tier encounters push heroes toward breaking points. The final boss, the Heart of Darkness, represents an encounter with something so fundamentally hostile to human cognition that survival is barely distinguishable from defeat. Dredge, 2023, Sunless Sea, 2015, and Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005. Each explored different registers of the hierarchy with varying degrees of success, but all confirmed the same principle. The Mythos power ranking translates most effectively when the medium can make the audience feel the escalation rather than merely see it. Music has found its own solutions. The relationship between heavy metal and Lovecraftian horror is well documented. Metallica's The Call of Cthulhu, 1984. Black Sabbath's occult atmospherics. The entire subgenre of Lovecraftian death metal exemplified by bands like Sulphur Aeon and the Great Old Ones. But the more interesting musical adaptations of the power hierarchy exist in ambient and drone music. Artists like Lustmord, Cryo Chambers Collective Projects, and the dark ambient scene more broadly have attempted to create sonic equivalents of the upper tiers, music that does not depict monsters, but evokes the sensation of vast, indifferent, inhuman space. A Lustmord album does not sound like Cthulhu. It sounds like what it might feel like to become aware that Cthulhu is the least of your problems. The musical hierarchy mirrors the entity hierarchy. Louder, more aggressive music for the physical terrors of the lower tiers. Quieter, more disorienting music for the conceptual terrors of the upper tiers. Silence, logically, would be the soundtrack for Azathoth. But even ambient musicians have not yet committed to releasing a blank album. The Cthulhu Mythos occupies an unusual position in contemporary culture. It is simultaneously the subject of serious academic scholarship and the source of plush toys, bumper stickers, and presidential campaign parodies. This dual existence is not a contradiction. It is a direct consequence of the tiered power structure we have been examining, because different tiers of the hierarchy lend themselves to radically different kinds of cultural engagement. The lower tiers are the ones most readily commercialized. Cthulhu plushies exist by the thousands. Cthulhu for President bumper stickers recirculate every election cycle. Board games, card games, t-shirts, coffee mugs, and enamel pins featuring tentacled, vaguely Cthulhuoid imagery constitute a minor industry. This is possible because Cthulhu, despite his cosmic significance, has a shape, a recognizable silhouette that can be rendered cute, menacing, or ironic depending on the context. He is the Mickey Mouse of cosmic horror. The brand ambassador, the entry point, the entity whose visual identity can survive translation into any medium or aesthetic register. The plush Cthulhu on a shelf at a bookstore is functioning as a cultural marker. It says, "I am familiar with Lovecraft." But it is also a domestication of the very thing Lovecraft intended to be undomesticable. The toy is evidence that Cthulhu has been ranked low enough in the popular imagination to be safe. The upper tier entities resist this process almost completely. There are no Azathoth plush toys, not because no one has tried, but because Azathoth has no stable visual form to reproduce. He is described as a nuclear chaos surrounded by piping flautists, a description that resists cutification as thoroughly as it resists cinematic adaptation. You can put Cthulhu on merchandise because Cthulhu has tentacles and wings. You cannot put Azathoth on merchandise because Azathoth is an idea, the idea of mindless, purposeless, infinite power, and ideas do not photograph well. The commercial hierarchy of the mythos thus mirrors the ontological hierarchy. The more abstract and powerful the entity, the less culturally portable it becomes. Academic engagement follows the inverse pattern. The entities that are most interesting to scholars are generally the ones least suited to merchandise. S.T. Joshi's decades of biographical and bibliographic work on Lovecraft, collected in volumes like H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, 1996, and I Am Providence, 2013, has established Lovecraft studies as a legitimate field within literary scholarship. The annual Lovecraft Annual publishes peer-reviewed articles. University courses on weird fiction are increasingly common. Within this academic context, the entities that generate the most analytical attention are the ones that carry the most philosophical weight: Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and the conceptual framework they imply, rather than the ones with the most recognizable silhouettes. The philosophical appropriation of the mythos has been particularly productive. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, the first volume of his Horror of Philosophy trilogy, uses cosmic horror as a framework for thinking about what he calls the world without us, the planet as it exists independently of human perception and human meaning. Thacker does not rank mythos entities directly, but his philosophical framework implies a hierarchy. The most interesting entities are the ones that most completely embody the world without us, the ones furthest removed from human categories. Ray Brassier's Nihil Unbound, 2007, pushes further, arguing that the extinction of meaning is not a catastrophe, but a truth, and that cosmic horror's highest achievement is making this truth emotionally accessible. Both philosophers treat the mythos hierarchy as serious philosophical material, not genre entertainment. The critical race theory engagement with the mythos adds a necessary complication to any power ranking. Lovecraft's racism was virulent, extensively documented, and inextricable from his creative work. His fear of racial mixing maps directly onto the Deep One hybridity of the shadow over Innsmouth. His xenophobia informs the alien otherness of virtually every entity in the mythos. Contemporary scholars and writers have responded to this in various ways, some by rejecting Lovecraft entirely, others by reclaiming and subverting his mythology. The World Fantasy Award retired its Lovecraft Bust trophy in 2015. Nnedi Okorafor, who received one of the last Lovecraft busts, wrote eloquently about the experience of receiving an award shaped like a man who would have considered her subhuman. This context does not invalidate the power hierarchy, but it does complicate it. The ranking we have constructed carries the fingerprints of a worldview that many of its current inheritors find abhorrent. The entities are philosophically profound and the product of a profoundly bigoted imagination. Both things are true simultaneously, and any honest engagement with the material must hold both. Internet culture has, characteristically, found a way to engage with both the profound and the absurd dimensions simultaneously. Subreddits dedicated to mythos lore produce detailed tier list arguments with footnoted citations alongside shitposts featuring Cthulhu and sunglasses. Creepypasta communities generate new entities that slot into the hierarchy without authorization from any canon keeper. The SCP Foundation, a collaborative fiction project that catalogs anomalous entities with clinical, bureaucratic language, is arguably the most successful inheritor of Lovecraft's world-building method. A community of writers producing a shared mythology through accumulated contradictory documents, exactly as the Lovecraft Circle did 90 years earlier. Power rankings are endemic to these communities. They are how the community thinks, argues, and builds. We return at the end to the question that has animated this entire analysis. Why do we want to rank the unrankable? The question is not rhetorical. It points towards something fundamental about human psychology and about the specific function that cosmic horror serves in the ecology of human thought. The most obvious answer is that ranking is a coping mechanism. Confronted with the genuinely disturbing implications of cosmic horror, that the universe is purposeless, that humanity is insignificant, that meaning is a local and temporary phenomenon with no cosmic backing, the human mind reaches for its most basic tool of comprehension, categorization. If I can put Azathoth in a box labeled Tier 1 and Cthulhu in a box labeled Tier 4, I have imposed a structure on the very thing that exists to deny structure. The ranking is a shield. It interposes a grid of human logic between the reader and the abyss. This is not weakness. It is the mechanism by which human beings have always managed encounters with the overwhelming. from the earliest mythological taxonomies of gods and spirits, to the periodic table of elements, to the Linnaean classification of species. We sort in order to survive. But there is a second, less comfortable possibility. Perhaps the ranking is not a shield, but a vector, a mechanism by which the ideas embedded in cosmic horror penetrate further into human consciousness than they otherwise would. Consider, you clicked on this video or began reading this script because the promise of a ranked list is inherently attractive. Lists are satisfying. Hierarchies are compelling. The format drew you in. And now, several thousand words later, you have spent sustained time contemplating the possibility that the universe is a dream being dreamed by a blind idiot, that space-time is the body of an alien intelligence, and that the correct response to accurate cosmological knowledge is madness. The ranking was the delivery mechanism. The payload was the philosophy. This dual function, defense and delivery, may explain why Mythos power rankings are so extraordinarily persistent. They have been produced continuously since Derleth's first systematizations in the 1940s. They appear in every medium: books, games, forums, videos, academic papers. They are never definitive, always contested, and endlessly regenerating. Each new ranking claims to improve on its predecessors while reproducing the same essential structure and arriving at the same essential impasse. Azathoth at the top, the void beyond Azathoth implied, but unmapped, and the nagging suspicion that the exercise was always more about the ranker than the ranked. The philosophical implications extend beyond the mythos. We live in an era of escalating scale awareness. Astronomical discoveries reveal a universe of 2 trillion galaxies. Climate science confronts us with temporal scales that dwarf human civilization. Artificial intelligence research raises the possibility of intelligences that regard human cognition the way we regard insect cognition. Deep time, deep space, and deep computation all produce the same vertigo that Lovecraft dramatized through his fictional entities. The power ranking of cosmic horror monsters is, in this light, a rehearsal, a controlled encounter with the feelings of insignificance and incomprehension that the 21st century is producing through entirely non-fictional means. Perhaps this is why the hierarchy keeps expanding. Every generation adds new entities, pushes the scale further, tries to imagine something more incomprehensible than the last. The progression from Dagon to Cthulhu, to Yog-Sothoth, to Azathoth, to the unnamed void beyond Azathoth, mirrors the progression of human knowledge about the actual cosmos, each discovery revealing a universe more vast, more indifferent, and more hostile to human meaning than the previous model suggested. The ranking does not converge on a final answer, because the cosmos it reflects does not converge on a final answer. There is always something larger, something older, something more fundamentally alien to human understanding. The hierarchy is a ladder with no top rung. We began by acknowledging that ranking cosmic horror entities is a paradox, an attempt to impose human order on creations designed to demonstrate the futility of human order. We have now spent considerable time inside that paradox, examining its historical origins, its philosophical foundations, its literary manifestations, and its cultural afterlife. The ranking is complete. Azathoth sits at the apex, a blind, mindless, unconscious infinity whose dreaming may constitute all of reality, and whose waking would annihilate it. Below Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth stretches across the entirety of space-time, knowing everything, containing everything, gatekeeping the architecture of existence. Below Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep schemes and manipulates with 1,000 faces. Below Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath breeds ceaselessly. Below them, the great old ones sleep and wait and dream. Below them, the servitors and heralds go about their incomprehensible business. And below all of them, looking up, trying to make sense of what they see, there we are. The list is complete. The list was always an act of defiance against the very things it catalogs. And now you know their names, which means, if the mythos is to be believed, that somewhere in the piping darkness at the center of infinity, something that cannot think has become fractionally more aware that you exist. Whether that awareness is meaningful, or whether meaning itself is the final illusion the hierarchy was designed to strip away, is a question the ranking cannot answer. It was never meant to. It was meant to bring you close enough to ask.